Welcome back. This is episode 2 of America, Yes or No. Before we get started, I recently got to thinking about the movie The Matrix. Its setting is a dark, dystopian, futuristic time. The premise is that humankind is being manipulated by an all-powerful group of computer machines, which keep the humans essentially fat, dumb, and ignorant to their own plight. The humans are actually kept catatonic in these little cocoons and are used to feed the machines. Anyway, the hero of the story is the One, who has the power to overcome the machines and return humankind to an actual, if difficult, existence. To start on his journey, he is given a choice of taking one of two pills, a red one, which fully reveals the unpleasant truth of humankind's situation, or a blue one, which will allow him to remain in blissful ignorance. He chooses the red one, of course, resulting in an entertaining movie and at least 2 mediocre sequels. Anyway, that movie kind of reminds me of what I'm doing here. I'm offering you the red pill, which, while it will reveal some unpleasant truths, should also enable you to see things for what they are, and to hopefully find some peace of mind in living your life by a set of true principles, rather than by the confusing and conflicting ideologies and policies that swirl around us. Additionally, there's just no substitute for the feeling of knowing that you're thinking for yourself, and not just swallowing the multitudinous lies and false notions that you've been fed. Also, at some point, you may well feel unable to have more of a say in what's going on around you. Anyway, I'm going to start today by talking briefly about the concepts of principles versus ideology. I've mentioned both of these words previously, and I'd like to take a moment to help better define them, their differences, and the role they play in our lives. I'm going to illustrate this difference by examining the changes that have taken place in media news coverage. I'm old enough to remember a time that when you turned on the TV or opened the newspaper, kids, Google what a newspaper used to be, you were reasonably justified in assuming that what you were taking in was more or less objective, true, and accurate. Certainly there were editorial articles and opinion pieces, but they were clearly labeled as such, and you took them in with that in mind. Also, there were significantly fewer network channels and news media outlets in those days, and before the advent of cable TV, each one of them went off the air every night. TV news was broadcast maybe 3 times a day, generally for 30 to 60 minutes, and many newspapers ran a morning and an evening edition. Magazines were a thing too, but generally they were as much commentary and entertainment as they were news. But by and large, that was it. We were not subject to a constant barrage of news and information. We could get away from it if we wanted to. The news at that time was not presented in any way to be entertaining, but rather informative. A news outlet's whole reputation was based, then, on its accuracy and its objectivity. That was the standard by which people affixed themselves to one of those outlets as their source for information. If a network acquired a reputation for inaccuracy or bias, people would tune out and the ratings would suffer. At that time, the principles of honesty and non-bias were more the governing factors of the content and presentation of the news. Well, as you may already know, and I'm sad to confirm, the days of accuracy and fairness in the news coverage have long since passed. One reason for this is that the majority of today's news sources have abandoned objectivity in favor of a sort of activist reporting. Many journalists have come to believe that it's their job to make a difference as part of their reporting. And poll after poll have shown that a vast majority of journalists and news personalities identify themselves as progressive or left-leaning. And, particularly since the last election, that bias has crept into and dominated their reporting. But there's another reason for this wholesale abandonment of fairness in reporting, and it has to do with the advent of the 24-hour news cycle. CNN, I believe, was the first all news all the time cable channel, but even they didn't go 24/7 until the outbreak of the first Gulf War back in 1990. In subsequent years, 24-hour cable news channels proliferated and, as competing entities must, each strove to find ways to differentiate their channel from the others. This was innocent enough in the beginning, being mostly confined to channels seeking targeted advertising, for example, to pull in certain viewer demographics. But the very fact that these channels had to justify being on the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even when there was little or no news to report, required them to start becoming inventive with their programming, which I know because I watched it happen. They began with hiring expert commentators who would periodically add color commentary to their news broadcasts. Over time, the commentators were given their own segments, wherein they could invite guests to offer their views or to argue with other invited guests. The news outlets began running news shows, semi-historical retrospectives, and so on. These news analysis segments, as opposed to just strict presentation of the news, were once reserved solely to the Sunday morning talking head shows like Meet the Press or Face the Nation, where viewers expected that they were getting as much opinion as they were actual news. These types of shows, while ostensibly providing thoughtful analysis, also became known for and began to compete with other networks on their entertainment value. This subtle transformation of news becoming entertainment has been slow but steady for years. Viewers who thought that by tuning into the news they were getting a window into what was happening locally and worldwide were actually now getting a carefully packaged version of events, one specifically designed to keep them more glued and entertained than actually informed. Well, after years of this ongoing phenomenon, an interesting thing happened. The networks realized at some point that it was the commentary and the news shows and the general slant of their news coverage, rather than the news itself, that was generating the most viewership. Today, of course, the news outlets have all realized that the road to increased patronage and thereby more advertising and bigger profits has gone from a 2-lane country road of objectivity and accuracy to an 8-lane interstate of partisanship and confirmation bias. Now, by confirmation bias, I mean that news and information outlets, in their undying thirst for eyes, ears, and clicks now with social media, are assuming that people nowadays don't really seek objective or accurate news sources, but rather they go to those that conform to their already baked-in beliefs. As an example, a news source that leans left, for example, if it dares to objectively report something positive about Trump, for example, risks more in the potential loss of its base viewership than it stands to gain from acquiring right-leaning viewers who are already more comfortable with the outlet that peddles their brand of the news. Hence, today, political ideology has become the governing factor of the content and presentation of the news. The principles of objectivity and fairness have been superseded by the political ideologies of left versus right and R versus D that now dominate our political discussion. Now, we've only spoken of the media here so far, but trust me when I tell you that ideology has also crowded reason and rational thought far from the realm of politics as well. Ask yourself, when was the last time you heard a politician, particularly one in front of a camera or a microphone, making a rational, cogent point about anything? Do they typically use reason or logic, or heaven forbid, cite the Constitution to make their case? Or do they instead speak in hyperbolic rhetoric, promoting fear and generally casting the other guy or the other party as the very embodiment of evil? Just as with the media outlets, politicians now seek only to pander to their own fired-up base constituencies. Other than what they can do to frighten the uninformed into following them, they have little to no interest in working with those from the other side or the other tribe. Like the media outlets, Modern politicians play almost entirely to those who already follow them. Only they don't do it for ratings or viewership. They do it for votes and for power. This simple but nevertheless wordy history lesson has been a long way of setting up the following question, which is, whom can we trust, or not trust, to know what's really going on in our nation or in the world, or to know what's right or what's wrong with our country? Ideology, which is defined as a set of opinions or beliefs associated with a specific group, is definitely not the pathway to truth. Indeed, ideology instead requires our unquestioning adherence to a set of predetermined beliefs. Ideologies tend to be linked to isms, such as socialism, capitalism, or racism. Another, more relatable example of an ideology would be a political party and its statement of beliefs. Ideologies bring with them a multitude of ideas and proposals, but we are usually asked or told to accept those at face value. Core principles rarely accompany an ideological movement. So when we're told to choose one ideology from another, as in the binary choice we're forced to make between Democrat and Republican, for example, who is to say which, if either, of those are right, or functionable, or even desirable? Principles, on the other hand, are basic truths or concepts that are universally applicable in our everyday lives. Honesty and integrity are good examples of principles. So is fairness and respect for others. The concept that everyone should be equal under the law is a principle. Treating others as we would like to be treated, otherwise known as the Golden Rule, is also a good and valuable principle. And do I dare mention the most well-known principles in the world, the Ten Commandments? Honor your God, your father and your mother. Don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. Principles are time-tested, having the weight of history and reason behind them, and because of that, they stand on their own merit, and they don't require justification, rationalization, or the force of law to support them. Principles are not always convenient, or popular, or politically correct, but precisely because they have proven to be universally true, they are something that we can always fall back on and utilize to reason our way through the conflicting and misleading nature of modern politics and ideologies. In other words, folks, we have to think. We have to reason. We have to learn and apply correct principles and use these in making our judgments and important decisions. As true principles are internalized and consistently applied by us, we can then listen to and discern from the countless messages out there competing for our attention. With principles on our side, we're not afraid to hear differing opinions, and we can meaningfully engage in a true marketplace of ideas. We can listen, ask questions, form opinions, and decide for ourselves which ideas have worked, which might work, or which have historically never worked, or which ones are just plain BS, and there are a lot of those. We can debate, persuade, and practice our freedom of thought and speech in a rational and mutually respectful manner, which, I might add, is the way it was intended to be in this great nation. Conversely, ideologies tend to be very rigid and entirely intolerant of outside ideas. See if any of these practices common to ideologies sound familiar to you. Ideologies are governed by a lengthy list of politically correct ways of thinking, speaking, or acting, and they require us to adhere to those without question. Ideologies are incapable of debating their beliefs, so when confronted, they must resort to either outshouting or eliminating dissenting ideas. Ideologies usually lead to confrontation and violence, and they are often the birthplace of despotism and dictatorship. To draw followers, ideologies will promote a fearful sense of us versus them tribalism, encouraging their membership to reflexively hate anyone not conforming to their tribe's policies or ideas. Ideologies will go out of their way to avoid common understanding or rational discussion because they find the fertile ground to thrive in an environment of chaos and fear. And lastly, ideology and ignorance, who are close cousins and BFFs, are almost always found together. It's been said that ideology is an enemy of free thinking. I entirely agree with that thought, and would add that it is also the enemy of reason. Here's the truth. Where ideology prevails, reason and free thinking retreat. So, by the way, does freedom. Unfortunately, ideological arguments currently dominate our socio-political discussions. They're not only a waste of time, but they guarantee that we stay polarized and at each other's throats, which makes us ripe for manipulation by unscrupulous politicians and others seeking power. Only in the consistent application of time-honored principle, historical context, common sense, and the ability to think for ourselves do we stand a chance of restoring our society and our nation to greatness, or even just to rational decency. As we do this, however, we'll learn to carefully weigh the things that we take in from government, media, and expert pronouncements, and be able to decide for ourselves what to pay attention to, what to ignore, and what to oppose. I'll close this episode, as promised earlier, by explaining why I named this podcast America, Yes or No. In trying to come up with a title, I mulled over several possible candidates, including some that I really liked but were already taken. But in the end, what I came back to was, why am I doing this? That's got to be in the name somehow. And the answer, as I mentioned previously, is that I am so very concerned about the America I now see, as well as the one my kids and kids' kids, etc., are going to inherit. With the exception of our own Civil War some 140 years ago, our nation has never been as polarized as it is now. We have essentially created a literal no-win situation for ourselves, in that we've become polemic and harshly intolerant in our political views, and we have politicized everything, from schools to public health, to our shopping choices, even our sports and entertainment. Everything has become a harsh, unyielding A versus B scenario, a tribalistic choice. You're either with us or you're against us. If you have a different opinion than me, then I have to dislike you, even hate you, even want you silenced. Even in the 60s, when political and social unrest led to bombings and assassinations, we still at least had the common thread that we were Americans first and Democrats or Republicans second. In conversation, we didn't lead with our political or demographic identity. We still had a sense that America, even with all its troubles, was still great and worth preserving, although we had differing opinions of how to do that. But today it feels as though we are literally in a battle for America as it was founded versus an America torn down and radically transformed. If you listen to the rhetoric, there seems to be no middle ground anymore. This is one symptom of ideology gone amok, of rampant tribalism. You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. There is no neutral ground. And after decades of history and civics being eliminated from our classrooms, agitators are finding it very easy to recruit willing followers from the ranks of our youth who've never been taught anything positive about their country. Remember what I said earlier about being easily manipulated by unscrupulous people? Today's unrest calls not for America to be repaired or mended, but for it to be torn down and rebuilt in an entirely different image. And that is not hyperbole, my friends. That is what is going on. If you doubt me, take a few moments to look up the core beliefs of the Black Lives Matter organization, for example, or the current platform of the modern leftist agenda. See what it is they're actually calling for and what they oppose. I know that you'd be shocked, but I'm also quite sure that you don't know any of it because of the carefully filtered versions of the news that are being reported, or in some cases, not being reported. These people do not want anything to do with the America you have known and perhaps love and want to keep. And what's worse, unlike the unrest of the 60s, there are people currently in positions of political power who are siding with those determined to tear down the country as it was founded. That is not trivial or insignificant. Look at what's been happening. Looting, arson, and assault, if all practiced by the correct side, is being not only tolerated but even defended by some lawmakers. And conversely, calls for law and order are condemned and dismissed as fascist oppression. And the establishment political opposition to all of this, where it exists at all, is weak and ineffective. One side of this equation is focused, determined, and unscrupulous, and the other is bumbling, greedy, and ineffective. And if things continue as they currently are, which side do you think will eventually prevail? And so, my friends, it has become a question in my mind, not of preferred political persuasion or nuanced policy difference, but truly a question of national survival. It's becoming a binary choice between a country adhering to its foundational principles versus a country adrift in ideological morass and locked in incessant strife. It is becoming a question of America, yes or no. Thank you for listening. I'll be back later with another episode, and until then, please, think for yourself.